Although I do remember at university being introduced to Aldous Huxley and reading his book Island, and being very impressed by some of the stuff there, which is all about sort of living in the present and appreciating things and so on, which of course comes from Buddhism, but I didn't know it at the time. But I really came across Buddhism again in my mid-30s when I was very involved in a whole lot of different sort of personal growth activities, and I got involved with women's projects, and we were doing a lot of different sorts of group work, that sort of thing. And one of the groups that I went to was actually run by a woman who was Buddhist, and she taught us meditation. We did walking meditation, we did a lot of awareness of body stuff, and so without knowing it I started to become more closely involved. I found friends who were Buddhist.
So what attracted you to meditation actually?
Well, I don't know that I ever was terribly attracted to meditation in itself. I always found, I'm quite an active sort of person. I always found sort of sitting for lengths of time didn't suit me very well. But I did find that being able to actually do some practice without having to sort of sign up on the line to any particular beliefs actually suited me. It gave me an excuse to do something that somehow fed this spiritual sense. And I think everybody has a spiritual sense and a spiritual need. And I think in me, like doing the practice sort of fed that without me ever having to sort of sign up to anything.
So there was something underneath working away, and it was kind of pushing you or directing you without you necessarily always being fully conscious of that.
I think so, yes. I think
it's interesting how that happens, isn't it?
Yes, yes. Yeah. I remember having, the woman who ran this particular group, I remember having a couple of sessions with her on my own and going along and talking about some dreams that I'd had, and they were all about churches. And she said, for goodness sake, you've got to sort out your spiritual life. And I was kind of, no way, I am just not interested in religion or spirituality. I've been there, done that, thrown it out. But she was quite right.
I think that happens to many of us. It's something underlying is working away, and we don't always recognise it, but somehow when we get in a position that we're clear, then we go with it, and that's the important thing, that we follow that.
Yes.
So you were both clear in one way to become Buddhists or follow that Buddhist tradition and Buddhist learning. What did it involve to start with? Maybe David, you answer that.
Well, when I was in my early 20s, I was living in Cambridge. And we were fortunate at that time, spoiled in a way, to have, partly because it was Cambridge and had this sort of reputation as a great academic centre and so on, partly because there was a lot of interest in spiritual things at that time, which had no more profound source than the fact that the Beatles had recently taken up with the Maharishi. And so there was a great
PR, didn't it?
That's right, it suddenly had this huge PR. Everybody was doing it. And so lots of people would come to meetings, and that attracted teachers, and we had a whole succession of teachers came to Cambridge. And so I studied samatha meditation with a Burmese teacher called Nai Moonman. I studied Karjapa Tibetan Buddhism with Chogyam Trungpa, very notable figure, very charismatic. I went to Zen classes. I went to Douglas Harding's classes on having no head, which was...
We've actually done a whole programme on that, actually. Yeah, that was fascinating with Richard Lang. Yeah.
And so on and so on and so on. And so I think my introduction to Buddhism, and I always have been and still am an avid reader, so in addition to the actual people who came, I was devouring whole libraries full of books. So my early exposure to Buddhism was very multidimensional, and I certainly didn't ever have never had a kind of narrowness or sectarianism or denominationalism about it. And even beyond Buddhism itself, I mean, although I am Buddhist and the things that you were saying about like faith and belief, I tend to see beliefs as a kind of structure that supports one's faith. And I can see that a number of different structures can equally well support one's faith. So I don't feel... I feel like if I'd met different people at that time, I might have been a Sufi, I might have been a Hindu. As it was, I met Buddhists, I became a Buddhist. Buddhism seems to me to be a system that has some particular excellences and merits. It's been very supportive to me, and I've stuck with it. But I don't feel any kind of exclusiveness about it in that sense. And I think that early education from a whole variety of different teachers, that certainly supported that kind of integrative, inclusivistic sort of approach to spirituality. Fundamentally, I was coming out of my own experience, so I was interested in anybody who could say something that seemed to speak to my condition, as the Quakers would say.
But you actually chose, both of you, Pureland Buddhism, which is a Japanese form of Buddhism, and I wonder why that was, because in a way the Japanese culture is so different from our culture here in the West.
Well, all these Buddhist cultures are very different from our culture here in the West. Do you want to speak to this, or...?
Yes, well, I can say a bit. I mean, it's quite interesting when you talk about us choosing Pureland, because in some ways I think Pureland chose us.
Yes, I think that's true, actually.
That was the one that connected the most with you, presumably.
Yes, it was a process that happened. And, I mean, again, I think one can trace it back in different ways, because we've only been sort of technically Pureland probably for about... Well, about 10 years. I mean, our organisation, Amida Trust, came into being in 1996. And at that stage, we were not particularly aligned to Pureland. We were actually practising in a different school of Buddhism. But over the first couple of years, the Trust itself was a group of people who came together because we were interested in social engagement, in applications of Buddhism, in Buddhist psychology and things. And originally, the people who came together came from different schools of Buddhism. But then, as we worked together and became closer, and it's a long story, we felt that we needed a common practice. And in many ways, at that stage, we started to embrace Pureland because we were befriended by a lot of Pureland groups. But that's only the sort of official line of the story, because there's another strand to it which I think is much more of a sort of undercurrent.
Which is this sort of unconscious undercurrent.
Unconscious, yes, that's right. And because you see, I mean, back as early as 1993, which is like 3 years before Amida Trust came into existence, David was actually writing a whole lot of pieces, poetic pieces and hymns, which were all addressed to Amida or Amitabha, who is the central figure in Pureland Buddhism. And they had a very strong Pureland leaning to them. And I think that leaning really came out of your original exposure to Pureland through your teacher, who was a Zen teacher.
Yes, in a non-doctrinal sort of way. I guess I've always been Pureland.
What does Pureland actually mean?
Well, the Pure Land, you could say heaven, if you like. Okay. So in Pure Land, you have a sense of, but Buddhism has the idea of rebirth, so there is the idea that you might be reborn in a Pure Land, but there is also a whole trend of Pure Land in this world, also within the Buddhist tradition. So the notion of Pure Land is a spirituality which engages with the world as a whole, not just with the individual. So it's also a faith centered religion in which the unconscious process is a lot more important, I think, than it is in many forms of Buddhism. Quite a lot of Buddhism as presented, especially as presented in the West, it presents as a kind of rational practice that you can take and get conscious control of your life by. So the presentation will be, people want to be happy, here's a methodology by which you can da-da-da-da. Whereas in Pure Land, there's much more a sense of an unconscious process that goes on, or an ambient process that goes on, and other power that carries your life along. So something that you can put your faith in.